A few weeks ago, I was having coffee with a group of moms, and we were talking about how there is a growing trend towards self sufficiency. That many people who in years past hadn't really talked about self sufficiency are feeling a call toward having a more self sufficient or sustainable lifestyle. Over the last few years, I have been creating a more self sufficient lifestyle, but I feel like I should preface that I am not a prepper. For me, self sufficiency isn't really about preparing for disaster. Rather, it's a space of empowerment, having both the supplies and the confidence to rely on myself for my family's daily needs. One of the main tenets of self sufficiency is learning traditional food preparation skills. So, for me, this really started with sourdough, learning how to bake bread using just flour, water, salt, and wild yeast cultivated from the environment. But as I always say, if you bake sourdough one time, suddenly you want a farm. I did not move to a farm and I don't have any plans of doing so, but I have found that milling my own flour, for example, is a traditional skill that offers exponential benefits. Knowing that if I have just wheat berries, or in this case, corn, I can make all of our favorite breads and baked goods and foods, and they are filled with 100% whole grain nutrition, and the grains are available at the ready, which I'll show you in just a minute. Here I'm actually making southern grits. So first I milled dent corn on the coarsest setting on my mock mill, and then I sifted it because some of it turns into flour and then there's other large pieces. So I set the flour aside and then I remilled those large pieces at a finer setting. Next time when I run those large pieces through the mill again, I think I'll drop the setting even more just so they're a little more fine. Really, that's a matter of personal preference, but I like my grits to be a little bit finer and creamier. So for the flour, I am just putting that in a bag and I will throw that into cornbread later. That's also really great for dusting a tray for making pizzas, for example. So I'll just save that for later use. Now, to make southern grits, it is simply just a combination of 4 cups of chicken broth to about a cup of grits. One thing about milling your own corn or flour is that you have to be a little bit flexible. I actually had slightly too many grits here, so I had to add a little bit more water. But in general, it's about 4 cups of liquid to 1 cup of milled corn. And then I add in a little bit of butter and cheddar cheese. Now I know that milling your own flour and corn is not practical for everyone, but what this underscores is that in a self-sufficient lifestyle, there is an emphasis on eating food as close as you can to the source. So rather than buying instant grits or a loaf of bread loaded with artificial ingredients, in a self-sufficient lifestyle, you opt for food with nutritional ingredients in the purest form that you can, that is accessible to you and reasonable for your daily lifestyle. Another tenet of practical self sufficiency is having a well stocked pantry. I always recommend having the basics on hand. Now, of course, every household has its own unique preferences and menus. For mine, I always keep the basics for scratch cooking and baking, a well stocked supply of grains. And as a side note, milling and baking whole grains is a hobby for me, so you definitely don't need as many as I have unless you want them, of course. And I always keep a year's supply of our favorite home preserved foods like peaches, tomatoes, and salsa. I recently published a beginner food preservation video and a freeze drying compilation. I will leave them in the description box below because they can be pretty helpful if you are new to your self-sufficiency journey. A well-stocked pantry does not mean that it has to be bursting at the seams with food, but it does mean that you have everything that you need to make food most days of the week. I do not have a homestead cellar. I do not have a basement. I just have a regular old pantry, and I store things in 2.5 gallon buckets like beans and grains and rice, for example. And I have all of the basics that I need for daily scratch cooking. So no matter what, at any moment when I open my pantry, I have the essentials for my family. Now, when you open my pantry, it looks like we have nothing to eat because I keep mostly just ingredients, not food products like pre-made foods, for example. And I think what's really important about that, if we're talking about self-sufficiency, is that the food we keep in the pantry ideally can be used in versatile ways. So a bag of flour can be many different things. Dry black beans can be cooked and used in a lot of different ways. So having these ingredients on hand that are versatile and that can be used in a variety of different ways helps stretch the way you use them and just makes your pantry more sustainable and sufficient. If you ask me, one of the best parts of a practical, self-sufficient lifestyle is gardening. It is February, so it is time for me here in Zone 8, North Carolina, to get my seeds going. Without a doubt, starting from seed is the most economical and self-sufficient way to start a garden. And so I'm actually starting seeds this year in my greenhouse. It's my first growing season, starting everything from seed in my greenhouse. We will see how it goes. And I'm just getting started here. So I'm starting off with a few herbs, a few veggies. I have tomatoes and I think tomatillos that I planted, and also a lot of cut flowers. Cut flowers aren't necessary for self-sufficiency, but they do make life a lot more beautiful. So if you have space for flowers, I recommend them for sure. And they also bring in pollinators, so it's worth it to have some beautiful flowers in your veggie garden. Now, starting from seed isn't the right option for you. I recommend getting transplants, and if possible, get them from a local grower, not a big box store. Often local growers or local nurseries will sell them much cheaper than the big box stores. The little local place down the street from my house, I think they sell 6 packs for $1.50. So I can get 6 tomato plants for $1.50, which is an amazing deal. And I also want to emphasize to start small. My best garden ever was a container garden in a tiny backyard in a townhome that I rented. Now, over the years, we have moved into a bigger house with more space. So we do have raised beds and a greenhouse, but that takes time. And I'm still learning along the way too. I've made a lot of mistakes. Last year was a total disaster in my garden, but start small. I always recommend starting with herbs if you don't know where to begin, because they're really easy to grow. They produce a lot and they are so expensive to buy at the store, but really cheap to grow. If you have spent any time at all watching my videos on YouTube, it is not shocking to know that I also feel that sourdough is a great part of practical self-sufficiency. Anybody can make sourdough bread, and it takes almost no skill. There is a learning curve to sourdough. If you're brand new to sourdough and you don't know where to begin, I do recommend downloading my guide to making and using sourdough starter ebook. It's totally free. It's 30 plus pages of how to make a sourdough starter, how to make your first loaf of bread, and more. I will leave a link for that in the description box. Here I am making sourdough bagels. And the thing that I like about sourdough is, one, it doesn't require any commercial yeast. You use yeast that's from the environment and the air and from the flour itself to leaven your bread, but it is so flexible and so forgiving. And when we're talking about a self-sufficient lifestyle, yes, it does mean sometimes we have to carve out time to do more things like cook from scratch and make bread. But if we are doing them correctly, they really don't take that much more time. And sourdough is really flexible. Here I'm using my proofing box because I can up the temperature and ferment my dough faster, but you could also put it in the fridge and ferment your dough slower. So that way you can work the fermentation length into your schedule in a way that works for you. Whereas with commercial yeast, it's just really fast and you have to be there to deal with it when it's ready, but you can really control sourdough. I have a ton of sourdough resources and tutorials on YouTube and over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. I will leave links for that in the description box below. One of the best parts of all of this for me is knowing that if I need bread, I don't have to go to the store to get it. I know exactly how to make it and I can do it with my eyes closed. And maybe bread isn't the most important part to you, but I think that's really what most of this is about, is having these skills that are meaningful to you and feeling really confident in doing them. And when that happens, it becomes second nature. It's not second nature to run to the grocery store to get something. It's second nature to just make it. And that is such a good feeling. Now, in the same vein, the last tenet of practical self-sufficiency that I want to talk about today is scratch cooking. Making your own food from scratch is really important in a self-sufficient lifestyle. And one of the things I really want to emphasize about that is that scratch cooking does not have to be complicated. Protein, veggies, butter, salt, pepper. That's all you need for a meal. And maybe some other things like chicken broth and flour, for example, but those are really the core parts of the meal. Now, you might be watching me make this beef stew in an Instant Pot and think like, oh, well, that's not very self-sufficient. Hey, it's 2025. I'm going to use the resources at my disposal, and I encourage you to do the same thing too. It is not self-sufficient if it can't be done. If the way that we are cooking for our families is so complicated, that it's just too overwhelming to do and it's easier to get takeout, that's not really going to work. But if it's simple enough that we can just throw a couple of things in the Instant Pot, mix it together, hit go, and have a nutritious family meal on hand, that is self-sufficient and it is so rewarding. This is sourdough rye bread that I made the other day, and then I sliced it and put it in the freezer so that way we can just get through it at a leisurely pace. What's really cool about frozen bread like that is you can toast it from frozen, which makes it really easy and convenient. And I really can't understate the importance of having a few recipes memorized that you can just throw together, that you have all the ingredients on hand for most of the time. The other thing about scratch cooking that makes it really manageable is to always make extra. Scratch cooking gets to be pretty daunting if you have to do it 3 times a day. But if you can cook, say, once a day, and then you have meals for a few days, that is really helpful. And the thing about a self sufficient lifestyle is that, yes, sometimes, like I mentioned, it does require a little bit more work. But as you hone those skills and you develop those muscles, you learn how to work it into your life and it becomes a lot easier. So if this is totally new to you and you don't know where to begin, I recommend picking one thing from this video that resonated with you and get really good at it. And when that feels like second nature, pick the next thing from this video that resonated with you and get really good at that. And then just keep moving one thing at a time, one foot in front of the other. If you found this video helpful and you'd like a little more inspiration about practical self-sufficiency, recipes, tutorials, and more, be sure to sign up for the email list. When you do, I will send you links to all my blogs, tutorials, videos, and more directly to your inbox. I will leave a link for that in the description box below. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and I'll see you again next time.